Hello again. In the first of this series, based on Kenneth Scott Latourette's book, A History of Christianity, Latourette was remarking upon the lack of central administration and therefore the great variety in Christianity in the first century. And now he talks about the transition into the second century. In the forepart of the second century, the picture began to change. While no single form of structure as yet prevailed, we now hear indisputably of what soon came to be the accepted pattern: a bishop governing a particular church, and of at least one bishop, that of the church in Antioch, acting as though it were his acknowledged right to address himself with authority to other churches. In the first quarter of the second century, Ignatius, bishop of the church in Antioch, while on a journey to Rome, under guard for martyrdom, wrote letters to several churches, most of them in Asia Minor. In these is seen something of the organization of the churches and of the conception which Ignatius had of it. It's clear that in several of the churches which he addressed there was a single bishop. Presumably, though not certainly, there was only one bishop in a city. Ignatius enjoined obedience to the bishop. He spoke of presbyters and deacons as though they were the recognized officers in the church, and commanded that they also be heeded. He declared that the bishop is representative of God the Father, and that the presbyters are the Sanhedrin of God, the assembly of the apostles. Nothing was to be done without the bishop, and the Eucharist was to be administered either by the bishop or by someone to whom he had entrusted that function. Ignatius held that it was not lawful to baptize or to celebrate a love feast without the bishop. He declared that he who honors the bishop shall be honored by God. Ignatius writes as though the bishop, the presbyters, and the deacons had come to be essential to the existence of the church. Presumably that was true of each of the churches he knew. These naturally were in Asia Minor and Syria. In his letter to the Romans, he does not mention any of these officers, but his silence does not necessarily argue that the church in Rome did not have them. The emphatic fashion in which he stressed these officers and respect for them may be evidence that the position which he advocated for them had not yet won general acceptance. A letter from the church in Rome to the church in Corinth, with which the name of Clement is associated, and which may date from late in the first century, and be earlier than the letters of Ignatius, declares that Christ was sent forth by God, the apostles were sent by Christ, and the apostles, preaching through countries and cities, appointed their firstfruits to be bishops and deacons of those who should afterwards believe. The letter also says that the apostles gave instructions that when these bishops and deacons appointed by them should fall asleep, other approved men should succeed them in their ministry. The letter indicates that the bishops were appointed by the apostles, or afterwards by other eminent men, with the consent of the whole church. It seems to imply that bishops were presbyters and that the church in Corinth had more than one of them. If this is true, the church in Corinth did not have the oversight of a single bishop, as did the churches with which Ignatius was familiar. It may be that Clement himself, although the leader of the church in Rome, was only the chief of a group of presbyters in that city. In later lists he is given as one of the bishops of Rome in succession to Peter, but this may be reading back into the first century, the institution as it existed before the close of the second century. Another early Christian document, the Didache of the 12 Apostles, or teaching of the 12 Apostles, describes a church organization which knew of traveling apostles and prophets and of resident prophets and teachers. It instructs the Christians to appoint for themselves bishops and deacons, and to hold them in honor, along with the prophets and teachers. There were several bishops, not one, and no presbyters. It has been suggested that here was a transition from an earlier structure of the churches to the later one, either in communities apart from the main centers where old customs lingered, or perhaps mirroring the change in some of the larger urban churches. In any event, the latter part of the first century and the forepart of the second century still saw variety in the forms of organization of the churches. This subhead is the Church of Rome. Well before the end of the second century, the Church of Rome was occupying an outstanding place in the total Christian fellowship. This was to be expected, being in the capital and chief city of the empire, if it were at all strong, it would naturally be regarded with deference by a religious community which was found principally within the empire. As we have seen, it appears to have been vigorous before Paul reached it. So important did Paul deem it that he felt it advisable, when he had been hoping to come as a free man and not as a prisoner, to precede his visit by the most carefully thought out and deliberately written letter which we have from him. In addressing the church at Rome, he declared that the news of its faith was already being spoken of throughout the whole world. Presumably, since all roads led to Rome, and the city was extraordinarily cosmopolitan and attracted representatives of most, if not all, of the many regions and races of the empire, the Church of Rome would, through its members, have ties with many different portions of the realm. For several generations, its language was Greek, the most generally used of the tongues of the empire, and this would further its widely extended contacts. Although not founded by either, the Church of Rome enjoyed the prestige of the presence of both Peter and Paul, and what appears to be dependable information declares that Rome was the scene of the martyrdom, both of the outstanding member of the original 12 apostles and of the chief missionary of the early church. The Epistle of Clement, which we have already mentioned, was written partly to ease a difficult situation in one of Paul's churches, that in the great commercial city of Corinth. It is evidence that the Church of Rome felt a responsibility for the peace of this sister church, and that it believed that an expression of its concern would not be regarded at Corinth as an impertinence. It may well have been that it thought of itself as being under similar obligation to other churches. Certainly in the third quarter of the 2nd century, Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyons, or Lyon, in Gaul, and who, coming from Asia, would not be biased by Roman origin, declared that, quote, "It is a matter of necessity that every church should agree with this church," that is, of Rome, "on account of its preeminent authority," unquote. This does not mean that the Church of Rome had the wide supervisory and directive functions which it later claimed and exercised through its bishops. However, the foundations for that eventual supremacy go back to the 1st century. Now, in the next segment, Latourette deals with the ideal unity and actual division in the churches of the 2nd and the 3rd centuries, an ongoing problem which we know was dealt with later. We'll put a link into Oscar Cullmann's discussion. Oscar Cullmann, that great theologian who spent so much of his life dedicating himself to ecumenism, that is, a dialogue among the various denominations and churches, and especially to the relations between Catholics and Protestants. His little book on unity and diversity in the church.